to the cloud. All right. Today is Thursday, March 14th. Welcome to the biweekly SIG Instrumentation call. There are a few topics on the agenda, so I will get started on the first one. So I guess first, API server tracing is not going to land as GA in 1.30. So I'll figure out the issues and we can move that to 131. But I did look into at least some of the possible solutions to the last remaining problem. And for context, that is that right now we don't trust the trace context that comes in on API server requests, which means that there's two problems. One is that if the API server makes a request to itself, that results in a broken trace, which means a lot of traces are broken because my understanding is the API server makes a lot of traces to itself. And two is that users, even highly privileged users, can't like force a particular request to be sampled, which could be very useful. And so there's two approaches I explored. The first is let's just make it configurable, which is kind of actually I was just rereading the document for component config the other day, and it kind of shamed me a little bit. It said like, people add config because they want to defer solving hard problems. So this would be basically deferring solving the problems and letting users who know that their endpoint is not exposed to the public internet, or I suppose don't care, turn it on such that they would be able to respect context coming in. This would be maybe useful for like scalability testing or something else where you're running Kubernetes in an environment that you control or that isn't production and want to debug stuff. Or maybe if you know that your endpoint isn't exposed to the public internet, you could turn this option on and then be able to like get tracing or force traces that way. So that's one option that we talked about in the past, but that I've been kind of trying to avoid. And the second option I explored.
None of the GitHub links are working right now because GitHub seems to be down.
Oh, should I share my screen?
Maybe that would be helpful because I can't access any of the GitHub links.
You tried in some other browser?
Oh, is it just Chrome?
It's Chrome.
Yeah, it seems to work fine for me.
Oh, are you not using Chrome?
Yeah.
I'm using Chromium, so maybe it's a bit different.
It might be a bad internal build.
I'm using
It is Chrome.
Okay, sorry, I want to make sure my email doesn't pop up, so.
Yeah, I always get a little paranoid, but super sharp.
Chrome tab, window. Hopefully this is right. So this is the first one I discussed. There'd basically be an option called something that you could enable to basically say like, look, I'm not worried about randos sending requests to my API server. And the primary concern here is denial of service. So if someone sends a bunch of sampled requests to you and you respect all the context, then you might generate a ton of traces. The second and maybe more interesting option to talk about is trying to restrict.
Oh, I like that.
Right. So this would restrict the trace context to only respecting the incoming context if the requester is in the group system :master, which to my understanding is basically,
lot more sense to me.
To my understanding, that's basically just the API server. Is that right?
Does the KCM also use system.master group?
Kube control. That's very possible. There was a group.
Yeah, maybe
a user for control.
Yeah, I think KCM and scheduler also use system master.
Maybe all the control plane components are using that one.
Yeah, I think KCM scheduler use system master.
Okay, that's very good to know.
Off the top of my head, but I'm not positive.
The way that this ends up being implemented is that this would move the trace filter from the very beginning of the request to after authorizations, because first we have to figure out if you're in the system master group, and then we can basically start our trace and make this decision. And moving the trace filter back has a few things that come with it. It has some downsides. The first is that obviously if you're doing anything interesting for authorization, that won't be captured in the trace. So you basically won't be able to see like that part of your trace. The second is that the start time is going to be slightly off, because if there's a bunch of latency, again, in the authorization step, then that won't be captured in the trace. That, I think, can be worked around by having something put the current time in the context, and then having the trace instrumentation read out the current time and use that as its start time later.
So can you include a group of, so it turns out the system masters is actually API servers only. But I would include scheduler and controller manager because we trust them.
Yeah, I'm happy to fine tune it. I'm more looking for feedback on the general approach, since we have time in 130 or 131 rather, I suppose. The final one is one that I wanted to make sure was called out here, which is that right now our metrics filter, or our metrics that we record in the API server, are recorded at the very beginning. And
Oh, that's not great.
if you start your metric and then you start your trace, your metric won't have an exemplar on it. So the downside of this approach is that either we would need to move the metric filter after the trace filter, which feels like a breaking change.
No, that's not, you can't make that change. Yeah.
The only other thought I had was that I talked about putting the start time in the context at the beginning of the request, and then using it when we start our trace to make the start times of the trace correct. We could take a similar approach for metrics, but it's still unclear to me. We presumably still want metrics for checks that fail the authorization check. So we would need to make I think there's a different handling. Maybe that could be made to work, but it does seem like at least a downside to not be able to get exemplars potentially.
I'm not crazy about this now.
You're not crazy about it now?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the final question I had was the solution I just talked about, moving the filter after authorization. It does not solve the use case of a user wanting to sample a particular request, right? Because I Googled it and it looks very hacky to become system master yourself. Apparently it's possible, but you have to SSH into the control plane node and do some weird stuff. So basically,
I have to copy the bootstrap token or something.
yes, you do.
Yeah.
You do bad things.
Yeah. I've done it before.
And so basically, this wouldn't solve that use case at all. And so my question for the group here is, are we okay moving that out of the scope of API server tracing and making that something that we try and tackle as a follow-on?
What then?
This would be making a way for users to force requests to be sampled. So either, you could probably tell me if this is even feasible, but for example, if someone was a cluster admin,
Yeah.
is that something that we could check as part of this handler chain? And in addition to system : masters group, also allow people who are cluster admins to do this? Could we?
Yeah, but it would have
expand
the same
allowance?
downsides as system master, I would imagine, because
If I can find ways to work around those downsides to keep the metrics correct and not lose anything.
I mean, I have a terrible hacky idea to make the system master idea work, actually.
Okay, what is that?
It's really hacky, and it's basically a mash of your two ideas.
Mhm.
So you allow this system master, you allow this system controller manager and system scheduler,
Mhm.
and then you internally cache the IPs as URLs that you are now allow listing. And then all subsequent requests take this allow list and do your first approach.
Is that
You don't actually need config for it. You just do it in memory. And it
Is that
initializes
fair?
after you get your first system masters, you can keep appending to it or whatever.
I mean, if you can convince Jordan, then I'm down to implement it, or help other
I
people.
mean, it's terribly hacky, right? It's terribly hacky.
I just don't even know if I was under the impression that like source IPs can't always be trusted, but it's a little out of my wheelhouse.
They can be spoofed. That's
But-
true.
But doesn't pre-entrant call like going through loopback come back in a separate handler than the normal calls that, like, let's say an app would do to the API server?
I only instrumented one handler chain, or I believe I only instrumented one HTTP server in the API server. So if I missed one, then I'm happy to go fix it. But
Because I need to look into it again, but I think at least in OpenShift we have two separate endpoint for the API server. One is like gated behind the service, and one can be accessed through loopback directly on the endpoint of the pod, I guess. But I don't know if I don't remember if it's like two different web server or just like the accessing is different. Hmm. But at the same time, like I've never noticed two web servers in the API server code, so it may just be that like there is two different ways to access the server, like the same server.
Hmm.
So yeah, maybe we could propagate something from the service and detect whether it's a loopback request or a normal request by doing so.
I've had that suggested, I guess. Unless it's after the authorization header, though, we haven't, presumably, like someone else could pretend
Oh yeah,
do things
yeah.
like that.
Yeah,
Or
you can maybe
Yeah, that's
that's
kind of
why
the
it's
same problem as the other PR that you have, where you kind of set an option that tells you exactly that the all the calls are trusted or not. So yeah.
And to be clear, this isn't like highly trusted. This is just we're trusting it enough that we're assuming it's not malicious. Like you can we're worried about denial of service, but it's like OTel has reasonable mechanisms to prevent denial of service. Like there's a queue that'll fill up and then you'll start dropping traces. So like, yeah, you could probably make it so that some of the telemetry from the API server gets dropped, or make someone's bill for tracing high if you're using a managed service. But on the whole, this isn't like going to crash the API server. One of the things we did as part of scale testing is make sure this won't crash the API server, even when it's enabled at 100% on a scale test. Catherine.
I have one question. So what will happen if someone want to hack the tracing? So will API server be down or just we get some wrong data?
So the few threats. So if someone is able to intercept a request that you have to the API server, and get your trace header, they can add telemetry that would have the same header as your telemetry. So they could add a branch to your trace tree that
Okay.
maybe looks real but never happened. It
Yeah.
would be extremely sophisticated, and I don't know what they would be trying to accomplish with that. So you can write extra data.
I mean, you can basically overload the API server with a bunch of garbage data. Yeah.
So the more serious thing you would worry about is denial of service, either making the API server use a bunch of extra CPU and memory to store things, or trying to send so many traces that traces for other requests end up getting dropped somehow.
Oh, I remember we have limiter for the tracing.
Yes, so there's limits to the size of the queue.
Oh,
So like it will fill up basically if it records a ton of them and isn't able to export quickly enough. And then traces or spans will get dropped at that point.
okay. I'm thinking if this case is not going to happen, maybe we can just do monitoring and do some limits on the load and tracing. So I have one question. Do we have some authentication secrets on the header? I think no, HTTP header in the tracing context.
I mean, the trace context headers and the authentication headers are separate. And my assumption thus far has been that we don't want to mix the two. Like authentication is the way to do authentication, and trace headers are the right way to do context propagation.
Okay.
I mean, I think we should definitely propagate traces that are self-requests from the API server, because the API server makes a lot of self-requests, and that is very valuable to trace.
Mhm.
Dropping those seems bad.
And do you think we should do that? It's like the other problem I had with the private endpoint option that I really didn't like was exactly that, which is presumably, since most API servers are exposed to the public internet, this self-propagation would be broken, right? So it's like, does that make sense? Like if we just took the option approach and kept everything else the same, in most cases we would not enable the option or recommend enabling the option. So it would still be broken for most Kubernetes clusters. This is for if we took this approach. Am I still sharing?
Then we don't seem to have very good options here.
Yeah. Is it
I
very
think that's
common
what-
to have the API exposed over the internet?
My understanding is, at least in GK, that's the default,
Oh, really? Oh, I see.
which is, yeah. Maybe Han can correct.
There might have been reasons behind that.
I mean, I understand it can be terribly inconvenient when you just want to keep cutting the darn thing.
Do we have the quota for tracing?
Are you talking about on GCP?
Yeah.
I mean, there is a quota for requests to the trace API. I suspect there's also a quota for the number of spans written as a cost control mechanism.
Okay. So it won't be a very big issue, because if someone wants to hack Satan, the quota Satan will generate an alert.
I think so. From my discussions with Jordan, who's been the one, I would say the main person who's raised concerns over this, it just seems like a bad idea to him to trust a trace context from anyone. Like if it's not a user, if it's just someone who happened to make a Gmail, like that's not a good or like anyone on the internet. That's not a good like boundary. And even if we think it's low risk, like we shouldn't be trusting random users.
Yeah, the more I think about it, the more like it seems that your approach with the tracing filter being after the authorization filter is kind of the only option if we want to make sure that we know which request can be trusted or not. But then, like, we need to resolve the problem of what to do with the exemplars. And like the only option also seems to be what you suggested, to put like the data inside of a context, and either we generate the metrics at the authorization filter level, in a sense that, well, if it fails authorization, we just generate the metric without the exemplar. And if it succeeds, then we can just like delegate the generation of the metrics to the tracing filter, but that's a bit hacky and messy, to be fair.
Yeah. I don't think we want, I mean, like hilariously, the trace filter we use comes with metrics. We just have them disabled.
Yep.
But they wouldn't match the existing metrics we have, not by a long shot. So like it would work, but it's not what we want, I think. I can try and prototype out getting the start times to still be correct, if that's helpful. Any other thoughts, Han? The other thing I thought of, just to be complete, would be a mixture of both. Would be we do the system master one, and then also you can turn it on to let everyone send traces, and that would be what we would tell users if they want to trace their own requests. Okay. If people have more thoughts, you can leave them on the
But maybe one, maybe just idea that I would throw out would be maybe a cache for the metrics, and just so we would build the cache based on the metrics filter, update the cache based on the tracing filter with the actual exemplar. And then once there is a metrics collection that goes on, we would generate the metrics on the go, essentially with like new const metrics from Prometheus. And we would do that like every time it's needed.
Huh.
But I'm not sure.
That's an interesting idea.
Like I've never done that with histograms, so I'm not sure how feasible that would look like. And that would be, but yeah.
We
Instead of having a cache of IPs, we could maybe have a cache of metrics, since that's the one of the problem.
Well, I was thinking, could we grab the trace context? No. Maybe, I don't know. But could we, in the metric filter, when we end and we actually do our observe, get the trace context from the context at that point?
I don't think so, because like to get a trace context, we would have to go through the tracing filter.
Yeah, because the tracing filter is below.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah, my idea would have been to more like store the value of the observe somewhere, but then I'm not sure. I would need to look into the client to see how the metric is generated, because maybe the timestamp at which the observe was made is important. And so maybe it's a bit more complex than what I'm expecting if we want to build a cache.
Okay. I think we're out of time, so we can continue discussing this on PRs and issues. Feel free to write out your idea on one of them.
Yep.
But thank you for the feedback, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You know.